The fascinating part on this research topic is that we can combine variety of different materials, not only from historical archives, but also from our colleagues working on natural sciences. So, for example, when I'm studying famines in Finland, I usually start with tree ring material, which has a signal of past temperature variability as well as precipitation or hydroclimate variability. And then when our colleagues with the tree rings have studied this, I then go into historical sources and look what historical material has written about these years that dendroclimatologists found in their own material. And we look first if there is mentions of bad weather extremes, climate anomalies, and then we go to look different traces of human consequences. So, for example, grain tides that we can use for a proxy to estimate past harvest fluctuations, as well as church registers. They have registers of burials, dead people, so we can estimate a little bit of the actual demographic consequences of these. For sure, much harder times than today. Majority of the Finnish populations, 80% or more, gain their livelihood, their bread on the tables from climate-sensitive grain cultivation. And it wasn't only the climate or weather that could take your harvest away. It was also the society at the time. For example, the crown had in 17th century rather high taxation. So if it was not the climate or unfavorable weather that took your extra grain from the fields away, it was the heavy taxation. So as a consequence, the peasant didn't have that much grain to store for the rainy day or the years of frost in case of Finland. So that made them a little bit more vulnerable. But we have to remember that it wasn't a homogeneous group of peasants. Some were more vulnerable than the others. For example, in a case of Finland in the 17th century, the so-called freeholders, so these are peasants who owned their lands, they could pass it on their son and their sons, again for their sons, over generations. Usually, at least when we look socioeconomically, they were more resilient, so less vulnerable than, for example, peasants who didn't have the same rights for the land, who have to rent their lands either from nobility or from the crown. So even with this peasant agricultural society, not every person was on the same level of vulnerability. And we have to remember as well that the peasants in the past, in history, they weren't just the passive victims of changing climate. For example, on the onset of the Little Ice Age, slash and burn cultivation became more and more popular in Finland. So we are talking now maybe mid-15th century. And this was most likely adaptation on the cooling climate and related lowering yields. Because with the slash and burn agriculture, you could get much higher yields than from arable cultivation. So the peasants of the time, they tried to adapt on the Little Ice Age conditions. The growing season started later, and on average also the average temperatures were lower than, for example, today or later part of the 20th century. So what that meant for the peasants or the farmers at the time, that their grain did not ripen before the time, before the first night frost commonly occurred in Finland. So they kind of have to chase again. The last famine, especially when we are talking of climate or weather triggered famine, this was in 1867 and it ended 1868. So 2 years of poor harvest and hunger in Finland. The main reason why some other years when the society experienced similar scale of harvest failure, but they didn't escalate in a famine, is the human actions. For example, if authorities or even individuals organized imported grain to help to cope with the food shortage in Finland. Also, if the authorities gave some tax reliefs, so they could keep the excess grain for their own consumption for the next year's seed grain on the year of poor harvest. So these actions of the society and individuals, so the human agency, this was the thing that dictated if a harvest failure would escalate in a famine disaster. And in the case of the end of famine disaster in Finland, we have to remember that in the case of famine mortality, the greatest killer usually is hunger-related diseases like dysentery, not starvation per se. So with Finland, the improvement of healthcare, sanitary, as well as with poor relief, these were important factors why Finland was able to escape from the famine disasters.